It started as a routine congressional hearing on police reform, but in just 5 minutes, Jasmine Crockett flipped the nation on its head. Joe Arpaio walked in proud, defended his brutal legacy, and dismissed decades of pain. Then Jasmine revealed secret emails, a federal pardon conspiracy, and the tragic death of a 12-year-old boy caught in his system. The courtroom froze. Millions watched. But what did Jasmine Crockett say that left America shaking and Arpaio speechless? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. It started with a headline that no one expected, but everyone instantly understood. Congress sets the stage. Crockett versus Arpaio. The House Judiciary Committee, known for its tense and often partisan hearings, had just announced a high-stakes session on the legacy of border security and police reform. But beneath the bureaucratic title, the real story pulsed with drama. Jasmine Crockett, young, black, fierce, and unrelenting, had been appointed as the lead interrogator. Her target? Joe Arpaio, the infamous former sheriff of Maricopa County, whose name was synonymous with racial profiling, tent city prisons, and federal contempt charges. No warning, no vote, just a late-night email from the committee chair's office. "You're up tomorrow." And yes, it's him. Jasmine stared at her screen, jaw tightening, knowing exactly what was at play. They weren't just calling on her legal expertise. They were throwing her into a political lion's den, hoping her fire might burn too bright, too fast. But what they didn't count on was that Crockett had never backed down from a fight, especially not one where the rules were rigged. Not when the entire country was watching. By 6 a.m., the story had already broken across major networks. CNN ran it under a red banner. "Face off at the judiciary, Crockett to question Arpaio in nationally televised hearing." Fox called it a clash of values, framing Arpaio as a misunderstood patriot and Jasmine as a radical firebrand. But the public saw it differently. Twitter erupted with anticipation. Hashtags like Justice and Sheriff and Crockett and Arpaio trended within hours. Journalists dubbed it a generational collision, while pundits sharpened their knives, preparing for spectacle. But Jasmine wasn't here for a show. She was walking into a room where every camera, every mic, every stare was either a weapon or a trap. She knew some of her own colleagues wanted her to fail, to fumble, to fold, to crack under the pressure of confronting a man who had been untouchable for decades. But she also knew something else. Every scar in this system had a name, and Arpaio's name was carved into too many of them. But in Washington, anticipation is never passive. It's volatile, calculated, and laced with power plays behind closed doors. As Jasmine Crockett braced for the national spotlight, she knew this wasn't just about policy or party lines. This was a confrontation years in the making, between two Americas that refused to speak the same language. And on the other end of this collision stood a man whose very name had become synonymous with a particular brand of fear: Joe Arpaio. To his supporters, he was Sheriff Joe, the lawman who never blinked, who ran his county like a frontier town and wore contempt for political correctness like a badge of honor. But to the millions who lived in the crosshairs of his badge, he was not a symbol of order. He was the embodiment of abuse, given a uniform and unchecked power. His most infamous creation wasn't a policy, it was a place. Tent City, an outdoor jail in the blistering Arizona desert, where inmates, mostly undocumented immigrants, black men and Latinos, were forced to live in military surplus tents under triple-digit heat. Some called it inhumane. Others called it a return to Jim Crow with camouflage netting. Arpaio, he called it deterrence. Inmates were denied air conditioning in 110 degrees Fahrenheit heat. Some were shackled for days in direct sunlight. When reporters asked how prisoners could survive such treatment, he shrugged and said, "It's not supposed to be fun. This is punishment." And punishment it was, indiscriminate, unapologetic, and racially skewed. Over 400 people were arrested under his orders with no legal cause, simply because they looked illegal. Entire communities were raided, families torn apart, and children left waiting at bus stops for parents who never came home. When a federal judge ruled that Arpaio's tactics amounted to racial profiling in direct violation of the Constitution, he didn't just disagree, he ignored the order outright. For months, he continued the raids, the detentions, the same heavy-handed tactics he was legally barred from using. Eventually, the Justice Department stepped in. In 2017, Arpaio was found guilty of criminal contempt of court, a rare charge for a law enforcement officer. The case was clear. This wasn't a mistake. It was defiance. But then came the twist. The moment that cemented Arpaio's legend among right-wing circles and infuriated civil rights advocates across the country. Before he could be sentenced, President Donald Trump issued a full pardon, his first as president. In front of cameras, Trump called Arpaio a patriot and a hero, ignoring the judge's ruling, the Constitution, and the families who had suffered. With the stroke of a pen, Arpaio was no longer a convict. He was, once again, a man untouchable by justice. Jasmine Crockett sat in silence, alone in her office as she read line after line of his record. She'd seen injustice before. She'd fought it in courtrooms, in state houses, in alleyways where the law forgot people. But there was something different about Arpaio. His impunity wasn't accidental. It was protected, sanctioned, even celebrated. As she flipped through a digital archive of sealed documents and internal memos obtained during her legal work years prior, one file stopped her cold. It wasn't marked urgent or top secret, just an innocuous title, MCSO Internal. 2011 briefing notes. She opened it with a click, expecting little. But what she found inside turned her still. An internal memo, time-stamped and signed, describing how patrols were to prioritize detention of non-English-speaking males within targeted neighborhoods and instructing deputies to maintain visibility in Spanish-speaking districts for maximum deterrence. One paragraph even advised that community pushback should be framed as threats to law enforcement safety, a preemptive narrative to discredit protesters before they even spoke. The language was coded, careful, but unmistakable in its intent. It wasn't just racial profiling, it was policy. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her hands moved with mechanical calm as she encrypted the file, printed 3 copies, and tucked them into a thin manila folder with her initials marked on the corner. This wasn't just evidence, it was ammunition, a weapon of truth sharp enough to cut through the smokescreens and slogans. As the printer clattered to a stop, the final page slid into the tray like the last domino in a long, ugly line. She picked it up, stared at it for a moment, and said softly, more to herself than anyone else, "You've silenced a lot of people, Joe, but not this time, not me." And just like that, the countdown to the hearing truly began, not as a formality, but as a reckoning. The folder was warm in her hands, the paper still faintly smelling of toner, fresh evidence pulled from the ashes of forgotten files. But now it was no longer Jasmine's secret. It was her sword. And as the hearing doors opened, the war for truth began, not with sirens or shouting, but with the slow, deliberate entrance of a man who once believed the law was his to bend. Joe Arpaio stepped into the hearing room like a man returning to his empire. His suit was a sharp desert beige, tailored and pressed, meant to echo the colors of the Arizona sands he once ruled. His chin was held high, posture stiff with pride, as though the courtroom were a parade, and he the grand marshal. Behind him walked his defense attorney, older but equally defiant, and a younger aide with a phone in one hand and talking points in the other. Cameras clicked in rapid bursts as the former sheriff took his seat with the swagger of someone who still believed he answered to no one. His eyes scanned the room, stopping briefly on the Democratic side of the aisle, but only briefly, as if to dismiss it as noise. He adjusted his cufflinks, leaned back in the chair, and exhaled like a man preparing for applause. Then the room shifted. Jasmine Crockett entered without spectacle, but the energy changed like a storm front rolling in. Her hair was pulled into a high, defiant knot, her earrings understated, her blazer as black and crisp as her tone would soon be. She wore no flashy makeup, no bright lipstick. She didn't need it. Her presence alone commanded a silence more powerful than any gavel. A few staffers looked up, some nodding in quiet recognition, others bracing for the collision they knew was coming. Jasmine didn't scan the room. She didn't need to. She walked straight to her seat like someone who already knew where every trap had been laid. When she sat down, she didn't even glance at Arpaio. That silence, that stillness, it was strategy. It was power measured in heartbeats. The chairman cleared his throat, leaned into the mic, and said what the nation had been waiting to hear. We begin today's hearing with opening remarks from Representative Jasmine Crockett. Every lens in the room pivoted. Every mic came alive. The red light on the center broadcast camera blinked twice, then stayed solid. Jasmine looked up, and 14 million Americans looked right back. The moment the chairman called her name, the hearing room shifted from ceremony to spectacle. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't adjust her mic. She didn't even glance at the cameras. Instead, she leaned in slowly, precisely, as if each movement was measured to create the silence that always precedes a detonation. Her fingers rested on the folder before her, its edge worn slightly from the tension in her grip. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Because the kind of power she held now didn't come from volume. It came from conviction wrapped in control. "Mr. Arpaio," she said, her voice soft enough to draw the room closer, yet sharp enough to still it completely. It was not the voice of a politician seeking applause. It was the voice of a litigator who had buried men twice as powerful in rooms half as formal. "You've stated repeatedly that your tent city facility was not inhumane, that it was legal, that it was necessary." She didn't look up yet. She let those words rest on the table like a dagger turned hilt first, offered, not thrown. But then came the shift. Jasmine raised her eyes, calm but piercing, locking onto Arpaio like she had waited her entire career for this moment. "So tell me, sir," she continued, "if it wasn't inhumane, if it was also justified, why were over 70% of the people held there never convicted of any crime at all?" The room didn't gasp. It froze. Arpaio blinked, once. His lips parted slightly, but no sound came. Jasmine didn't let the silence save him. She pressed on, her voice still level, almost surgical in its precision. "That's not speculation. That's not coming from a protest rally or a news article or liberal media. That's coming from your own intake records, records logged, time-stamped, signed off by your officers during your tenure." She flipped open her folder and pulled a single page from the stack, holding it up. Not to wave, not to perform, but simply to confirm the truth in black and white. 72% of detainees, booked, processed, held in 100-degree desert heat, forced into pink underwear, denied fans shade, and sometimes water, were people who hadn't been found guilty of anything. Now she leaned back, just slightly, but in that inch of space was a tsunami of moral gravity. "You say it wasn't punishment, Mr. Arpaio," she said, voice low and steady. "But when someone hasn't even been tried, hasn't stood before a judge, and you put them in the desert with no air, no bed, and no due process, what exactly would you call that?" The weight of that question didn't just fall on Arpaio. It dropped on every person watching, on the aides shifting uncomfortably behind him, on the congressional members checking their notes but now unable to look away, on the millions watching live across the country who suddenly realized this wasn't going to be just another hearing. This was the reckoning. The silence after Jasmine's question wasn't the kind that invited answers. It was the kind that exposed the absence of them. Joe Arpaio shifted in his chair, not enough for most people to notice, but Jasmine saw it. That subtle tightening of his jaw, the twitch in the corner of his left eye, the way his fingers drummed once against the oak tabletop, then stopped. These weren't signs of strength. These were signs of a man recalculating. When he finally responded, it wasn't with facts, it was with reflex. "Those numbers," he said, voice thick and raspy, "are just statistics. They don't show the whole picture. We had to maintain order. Law enforcement doesn't work on theory, it works on discipline." He paused as if waiting for the air to back him up. It didn't. "People want safety," he added, his tone rising like he was talking past Jasmine, past the committee, straight into the cameras. "And safety requires strength. You can't go soft on crime." It was the same tired refrain he'd used for years, polished like a badge that no longer shone but still carried weight in the right echo chambers. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't need to. Not yet. Her silence was deliberate, precise, unnerving. Then with calm hands, she reached into her folder once again. Not frantically, not dramatically. Slowly, methodically. And from it, she pulled a single photograph. It wasn't grainy or abstract. It was heartbreakingly clear. She slid it forward across the polished surface of the witness table, and it came to a stop just inches from Arpaio's cuff-linked wrist. The image showed a man, young, Hispanic, shirtless, lying on sun-baked ground beneath a canvas tent that offered no shade. His lips were cracked, his skin blistered, his eyes open, but lifeless. Jasmine's voice, when it finally returned, was soft, devastatingly soft. "This is Anthony Nunez," she said. "He was 28 years old. He was arrested for unpaid traffic tickets. He never got to court, never got to explain. He was placed in Tent City while awaiting his hearing, and he died." She let that sit, then added, "From heat stroke, alone, on a concrete slab, at 120 degrees Fahrenheit. His internal body temperature was 108 when they found him. Every corner of the hearing room seemed to contract at once. Chairs didn't creak. Papers didn't rustle. Even the usual hum of HVAC above them seemed to vanish." Jasmine didn't raise her voice, not because she was being calm, but because this kind of truth didn't need a spotlight. It needed silence. It needed witnesses. Arpaio opened his mouth, but before words could form, Jasmine cut in. Just enough to take control, not enough to shout. "You say this is about safety. You say law and order aren't always pretty. But tell me, Sheriff, what law was Anthony Nunez violating when he died in your custody without ever being convicted of anything?" Arpaio leaned forward now, voice louder, trying to regain control, not of the hearing, but of the narrative. "The law has to be respected," he barked, his tone caught between defiance and desperation. "You can't run a system if people think there are no consequences. We had to be tough. We had to send a message." Jasmine nodded slowly, as if she'd been expecting exactly that. She leaned forward, not aggressively, but with the still, focused energy of someone who had just reached the center of the target. "Consequences," she repeated, almost whispering. "Let's talk about those." Her eyes didn't move. "You disobeyed a federal court order. You defied the Constitution. You racially profiled American citizens. You were found guilty of criminal contempt, and then you were pardoned. Not because you showed remorse, not because you cleared your name, but because power protects power. Because somehow consequences are for the people you locked in tents, not the man who gave the order." Then she paused, just long enough. Her next sentence came like a scalpel. "Where is the justice when a man breaks the law and is rewarded for it?" That line didn't echo in the room. It landed. The word justice still lingered in the air, like the scent of smoke after a controlled explosion. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't done, not by a long shot. What she had delivered so far was only the prelude. The emotional blow of Anthony Nunez's death had cracked the room open. Now she was ready to set the foundation on fire. Her fingers moved back to the folder, deliberate, unshaking. This time she didn't just pull out a document. She held up a classified internal email, sealed and redacted for years. Its subject line printed in bold: "Target profiles, high-risk units." Her voice was low, calm, almost unnervingly steady. "This," she said, "is an internal communication dated April 3rd, 2012, between Commander Gerald Mendez, your subordinate at MCSO, and a regional officer at ICE. The subject?" She raised her eyebrows slightly. "Pre-identified neighborhoods for rapid extraction operations." She waited a beat before continuing, her tone hardening. "This email includes a list of apartment complexes, trailer parks, and schools. Yes, schools, where the only selection criteria were Spanish-speaking households, low-income housing units, and the absence of U.S. citizenship records." She paused again, longer this time. "Not warrants, not criminal flags, just ethnicity." Then she read it, word for word. "We recommend executing Phase 2 before end of month. Focus on quick pickups. Use pre-cleared units to minimize press exposure. Target lists attached." Gasps. audible gasps, not just from the public gallery, but from aides, staffers, and even two committee members seated across the aisle. The oxygen seemed to vanish from the room as Jasmine laid the page flat on the table, sliding it forward like a queen placing a final piece on a chessboard. "Sheriff Arpaio," she said, eyes blazing now, "you didn't just violate people's rights. You engineered a system to erase them. Quickly, quietly, and efficiently." She tapped the document with one finger. "And now, after all these years, this evidence is no longer sealed, no longer hidden, no longer safe." Across from her, Arpaio's face paled, not from embarrassment, but from calculation. For the first time, he didn't have a soundbite ready. No slogan, no smirk, no scripted defense, just silence. And in that silence, the room understood. This was no longer politics. This was exposure. The oxygen in the room hadn't yet returned when Joe Arpaio did what career survivors always do when the tide turns against them. He played the distance game. He straightened up in his chair, smoothed the front of his suit, and leaned forward just enough to project control without looking defensive. But Jasmine had seen this before. This was classic Arpaio. Never apologize, never acknowledge, always disown. He cleared his throat, looked toward the committee members, not Jasmine, and said in that trademark gravel voice that once echoed across Arizona press briefings, "Let me be perfectly clear. I didn't personally authorize those actions. My team operated under standing protocols. What happened in the field didn't cross my desk." His delivery was steady, well-rehearsed. "It sounds like some people beneath me made judgment calls that may have gone too far," he added, shifting the weight of responsibility to ghosts. "But I never saw this email you're referring to. I never signed anything that directed those kinds of targeting methods." He even shrugged slightly, just enough to seem exasperated, as if he were the victim here, blindsided by bureaucratic chaos beneath him. He looked down at his papers, pretending to search for clarity, but really just trying to outlast the moment. A few of his allies on the dais nodded gently, as if his denial had bought him an inch of breathing room. But Jasmine didn't blink. She let his words hang in the air like smoke curling toward a sprinkler. And then calmly, without theatrics, without even adjusting her mic, she dropped the hammer. Her hand reached back to the folder that had, by now, become something far more dangerous than paper. From it, she slid out a second document, older than the email she'd just exposed, but far more lethal. It had been printed on letterhead from the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. Faint coffee stains dotted the lower margin. Time had yellowed its edges. But the signature was in sharp, permanent blue ink. She held it up with both hands and said slowly, for the benefit of every camera and every future newsreel, "Then you'll need to explain this." The room leaned in, consciously or not. "This is a March 30th, 2012 internal directive," she continued, her tone unshakable. "It outlines the operational framework for what your office called Phase 2 sweep planning, which, as the email I read earlier confirms, included undocumented sweeps focused on Spanish-speaking neighborhoods, regardless of criminal status." She paused for effect. "This isn't hearsay. This isn't a second-hand briefing. This document includes logistical notes, timelines, and," she raised it higher, turned it toward the room, "an approval line, initialed and signed by one man." She looked directly at Arpaio now. "You." She stepped aside slightly, allowing a congressional aide to collect the document and feed it into the overhead scanner. Seconds later, the chamber lights dimmed slightly, and the projector cast it in full view behind Arpaio. There, glowing across a 70-inch government-issued screen, was the signature, Joseph M. Arpaio, in unmistakable cursive, next to the box marked, "Approved for Interagency Coordination." You could hear chairs tighten, shoes scuff, the collective sound of people realizing they had just watched a lie unravel in real time. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She simply said, "You didn't just know, Sheriff. You gave the green light. You didn't watch this happen from a distance. You orchestrated it." Her voice sharpened, not louder but colder. "So I'll ask again. When exactly did you forget signing your own name?" The cameras caught it, a flicker in Arpaio's eyes. For a moment, he looked not like the unshakable lawman of old, but like a man cornered by his own past, staring at the ink trail he could no longer outrun. The silence that followed wasn't disbelief, it was recognition. The signature still burned behind him on the giant screen. Silent, undeniable, permanent. But Sheriff Joe Arpaio was not a man built for silence. For decades, when cornered, he didn't back down. He shifted blame, raised his voice, and tried to shrink the room around him. That instinct hadn't left. And now, in the face of overwhelming evidence, he reached for the oldest weapon in his arsenal: arrogance. He leaned forward suddenly, as if trying to regain control by sheer force of posture, his voice flaring not with clarity but with insult. "I don't need a morality lecture," he snapped, "from someone who's never walked a beat. You want to talk law and order? Try being the last line between chaos and the innocent. Try facing real criminals in the dark without knowing if you'll make it home. You read memos. I've lived in the line of fire. I've made the hard calls." His hand cut through the air, gesturing toward Jasmine like she was a child out of her depth. "You don't know what it takes to keep people safe. You've never worn the badge. So forgive me if I don't take policing advice from someone who's only seen the fight from behind a desk." It wasn't just an attack. It was a calculated dismissal, designed to strip her authority, her experience, even her humanity in front of a national audience. But Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't recoil. She didn't even shift in her chair. She waited. Let the words hang. Let him dig. Then she slowly exhaled through her nose, like a boxer refusing to rise to a taunt. When she finally spoke, her voice didn't rise. It dropped, lowered to a calm so cold it cracked the floor beneath it. "Tell me something, Sheriff," she said, not looking at the cameras, not playing to the crowd. Just him. "In your version of keeping order, does that include arresting 12-year-old boys because they look out of place? Does it include locking up citizens who don't speak English just because they don't understand how to explain themselves? Does it include this?" Her hands moved, not fast but steady, and from a smaller folder she pulled a photograph and a police report. She held the photo for a moment in her hands. It wasn't for the projector, not for the press pool. This wasn't for spectacle. This was for justice. Then she set the image gently in front of her mic. Her voice did not crack, but her eyes did darken. "This is Mateo Jimenez," she said quietly, 12 years old, born in Tucson, Arizona, U.S. citizen. On May 4th, 2014, he was walking home from soccer practice, alone, wearing cleats and carrying a water bottle. One of your patrol teams picked him up. They said he matched the description of someone foreign walking near a construction site. His only crime? She paused. He didn't have his school ID on him, and he didn't speak English. Now the room was silent, not in confusion, but in something heavier: guilt, dread, recognition. Mateo was detained for 42 hours. 42. She emphasized the number. No call to his parents, no access to a lawyer, no interpreter. For the first 12 hours, no food, no water. A 12-year-old boy. When he was finally released, no one apologized. No one called the family. No press release. Just a child, dumped back into the world with a trauma no child should carry. Jasmine took a breath, but only to keep from shaking. She picked up the second sheet, the official MCSO intake report, and held it up briefly. It's all here. Time of arrest, officer's name, holding conditions, and your department's signature approving the sweep zone. She lowered the paper, then paused. Not for drama, but because the next sentence was one no person should ever have to say out loud. 3 weeks after his release, Mateo took his own life. She said it with no tears, not because it didn't hurt, but because the hurt had hardened into steel. He hung himself in his bedroom closet. His mother found him, in his soccer uniform. Even Arpaio didn't speak now, and in that terrible stillness, the hearing stopped being a debate. It became a reckoning. The room had gone still, not quiet, still, like the moment before a siren begins to wail. Mateo Jimenez's name still hung in the air, too sacred now for anyone to follow it with politics. Arpaio sat motionless, his shoulders tight, lips thinned. But even he understood. There was no pivot from this. Not when a 12-year-old boy had died with the taste of trauma still fresh on his tongue. and not when the country was watching. But what neither man nor committee knew in that instant was that outside those wooden walls, the world had already changed. Jasmine Crockett's voice didn't just rattle the halls of Congress, it shattered the boundaries of silence across the nation. It began on Twitter. Exactly 17 minutes after Jasmine uttered Mateo's name, the hashtag Arpaio and Crockett shot into the national trends. By minute 23, it had already passed Biden's speech and NFL draft. By the half-hour mark, it was joined by another, Tent City Truth, and this one hit even harder. Because this wasn't just about politics anymore. It wasn't even just about Arpaio. It was about the flood of pain that had been waiting years, decades for a microphone. The tweets came first in trickles, then in a torrent. Anonymous accounts, verified ones, burners, veterans, paralegals, mothers, former detainees. Some had never spoken publicly before. Others had tried for years, drowned out by bureaucracy and spin. But now, with Jasmine's voice as a spark, the floodgates had burst. They took my husband in 2009. He had just dropped our daughter off at school. He was never charged. He came back 11 days later with infected blisters on both feet. I never forgot the smell of his skin when he got home. I was 17. My crime. Standing outside a Home Depot and looking nervous. I spent 4 nights in Tent City with grown men who thought I was a spy. I still sleep with the lights on. My uncle was diabetic. They wouldn't give him insulin. Said it wasn't urgent. He passed out in the tent. Took 3 days before he saw a nurse. That was under Arpaio. I have the paperwork. And then came the video clips. Unfiltered, raw, unedited truth. Grainy footage taken from flip phones and old camcorders. A man with deep burn scars down his arms showing a photo of himself chained to a fence post. A teacher in Phoenix holding up student essays written by children who watched their parents get detained through classroom windows. A pastor who used to hold Sunday services outside Tent City because detainees said they could hear the music through the fence. They couldn't come to church, he said, so we brought church to them. And Jasmine Crockett? She just brought justice to them. By the end of the first hour, Tent City Truth had over 4.8 million mentions. TikTok creators stitched Jasmine's voice over video edits of protest marches, ICE raids, even drone shots of the long-abandoned Tent City facility. Its rusting fences and torn tarps, now symbols of a country's forgotten conscience. Instagram flooded with photos of old booking forms, mugshots, and the red-pink glow of sunburned skin. Facebook groups formed with names like We Were There and Children of the Tents. Reddit threads popped up with maps, timelines, and legal documents once buried in court archives, now in full public view. In Atlanta, a mural artist began sketching a 20-foot portrait of Jasmine Crockett holding up Mateo's photo. In Chicago, a group of immigration lawyers set up a hotline specifically to offer free counsel to anyone previously detained under Arpaio's command. By nightfall, churches rang bells. Local news anchors in Arizona wept through live broadcasts. And yet, in the center of the storm, Jasmine said nothing. She sat in her chair, hands folded, eyes steady, listening not to the noise but to the weight of it. She knew this wasn't hers. She hadn't started it. She had only given it permission to exist, and sometimes that's all justice needs. Her staffer leaned over, whispering, "Twitter's gone nuclear. You're all over MSNBC. CNN is rebroadcasting your cross-exam on a loop. There are vigils forming in Phoenix and Tucson. Do you want to make a statement?" Jasmine didn't answer right away. She looked across the room, past Arpaio, past the blinking red lights of the cameras, and whispered so softly only her aide could hear, "Let them speak first. We've silenced them long enough." Outside the Capitol, the press line was growing. Journalists from every major outlet shoved mics into each other's space. "Congresswoman Crockett, do you believe Arpaio committed a federal crime? Will you introduce legislation to reopen Tent City investigations? Did you have prior knowledge of the ICE coordination documents?" But Jasmine didn't come out. She let the survivors have the microphone instead. A woman in her 60s stepped forward to a CNN live feed. She held a photograph. Her son, age 23, who had been picked up at a Greyhound station in 2010 and never came back. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "They said he wasn't legal, but he was born in Flagstaff. He had a speech delay. He couldn't tell them where he lived. They thought he was lying. She paused, looked at the camera. We buried him in silence. But today, she said his name without even knowing it. She made him visible again. A 9-year-old girl stood beside her father, who had spent 11 months in Tent City. She read from a note card. Thank you, Miss Jasmine. My daddy came home. I hope the other kids' daddies do too. That clip alone would rack up 34 million views in 2 days. And as the sun dipped lower over the Capitol dome, something unthinkable began to happen. Prominent conservative voices, some of them once defenders of Arpaio, began to issue carefully worded statements. One former Arizona state senator tweeted, "We were wrong. The truth hurts." Thank you to @Jasmine Forrest for showing what accountability looks like. A sheriff in Texas announced a review of his department's immigration detainment protocols. A coalition of mayors issued a joint letter asking the Department of Justice to reopen inquiries into Arpaio's ICE partnership history, and the House Oversight Committee announced it would hold a special session the following week, focused solely on the long-term consequences of unchecked law enforcement overreach. But perhaps the most haunting moment of the day came just before midnight. A reporter from the Arizona Republic, broadcasting live from outside a shuttered Tent City gate, said, "I've covered Sheriff Arpaio for over 20 years. I've seen lawsuits come and go. I've seen press conferences, protests, rallies. But I've never seen this. Never seen the flood of voices, pain, and memory rise this fast. All of it, every ounce of it, was unlocked by one hearing. One woman and a 12-year-old boy named Mateo." The wind rustled the chain-link fence behind him, where someone had spray-painted just hours earlier. You can't bury the truth forever, it grows back. The sun had long dipped behind the Capitol dome, but inside the hearing room, the heat had only just begun to rise again. Jasmine Crockett sat still, her fingers interlocked, eyes focused. Around her, the oxygen felt heavier, thick with expectation, tension, and the weight of everything that had just unraveled. And yet, even as millions watched in the stunned silence across the country, Jasmine had not played her final card. Not yet. The viral outcry had detonated across social media. The streets outside were filled with chants and candlelight. Old victims were reclaiming their voices. And yet in the hearing room, one man still sat with his spine straight and his mouth clenched, as if decades of harm could still be shielded behind slogans and denials. Joe Arpaio, pardoned, defiant, untouched, until now. Jasmine looked up. "Mr. Chairman," she said softly but clearly, "with permission, I would like to enter one more piece of evidence into the congressional record." There was a murmur, a pause, then a nod. She pressed a button on the console in front of her. The room darkened slightly as the monitors lit up. No visuals this time, just a waveform, just sound. A voice crackled through the speakers, grainy but unmistakably real. It was a recording of a phone call. Male voices, low and cautious. "Look, we need to get this pardon done before the midterms pick up steam. The sheriff's a symbol. We can't afford to let the far left spin him as a criminal. That narrative's poison." A pause. Then another voice, slicker, polished but colder. "We've got a memo drafted, just need confirmation from upstairs. The language is law enforcement legacy. Stick with that. We don't defend the contempt charge. We pivot, make him a martyr, something to rally the base." And then the third voice, deeper, slower, southern-tinged. Sheriff Arpaio stood firm when most people folded. He's rough, sure, but the left needs a reminder. This is a signal. You come after us, we come back harder. The audio crackled. Someone chuckled. The conversation continued. "So we all agree. Trump signs it by Friday. Quiet drop. Weekend headlines. That gives Fox time to spin it before Sunday. Done? He stays our tough guy. We use him to crush the narrative before it grows legs." Jasmine didn't say a word. She let the silence settle. The implication did the speaking. The entire room froze. Congressional aides blinked at each other. One Republican member opened his mouth, then shut it again. The voice in that tape wasn't confirmed, but it didn't need to be. The content alone was a grenade tossed into the illusion of justice. Then, as if trying to rise from the ashes of exposure, Arpaio slammed his palm onto the table. The sudden noise cut through the room like a rifle shot. His face was flushed now, not with pride but with fury. "This is outrageous," he barked, eyes darting from one committee member to another. "This isn't a hearing. This is a goddamn political ambush. You're using this room to stage a hit job, to smear a man who's served his country longer than she's been out of law school." He jabbed his finger in Jasmine's direction, veins bulging in his temple. "You want to talk about justice? This isn't justice. This is a circus, a televised takedown. I won't be part of it." Reporters in the back typed furiously. Cameras zoomed in. Some aides flinched. But Jasmine? She didn't move. She waited for the roar to collapse under its own weight. Then with a voice low and calm, so calm it cut deeper than shouting ever could, she replied, "No, Mr. Arpaio, this isn't a political circus, and it's not a courtroom." She paused, her gaze locked, unwavering. Then louder. For the room, for the record, and for the millions watching from their screens. This is where justice is televised nationwide. This is where the truth finally gets a microphone. There it was again. That stillness. That terrible stillness that came not from fear, but from realization. Jasmine didn't blink. She leaned into the silence like it was her witness. "You call this political? But what's more political than a pardon drafted not from mercy, not from law, but from strategy? What's more political than choosing to erase a conviction, not because it was wrong, but because it was inconvenient to your base?" Her voice dropped again, cold, controlled. "You weren't pardoned because you were right. You were pardoned because you were useful." And now finally Arpaio had no slogan, no smirk, no sanctuary. The committee chair's gavel tapped once. "Order!" But no one moved, because something larger had just shifted. Across the nation, the tape played on every network. Major podcasts interrupted streams mid-episode to break the audio. By morning, legal analysts were demanding authentication. White House press secretaries issued a blanket denial. No knowledge of this recording. No comment. But the internet didn't wait. Voice comparison AI ran in real time. TikTok exploded with side-by-side analysis of speech patterns. "That's definitely him," one clip said. "That's senior staff. That's strategic language. That's not mercy. That's manipulation." In Phoenix, a group of retired officers posted an open letter. "We can no longer defend a man who used our badges to build his brand. The mask is off." In Chicago, a community college canceled classes to host a town hall on state violence. In Miami, a group of high schoolers staged a walkout. Their signs read, "Justice isn't just a word," thanks to Jasmine. But even amid the eruption, Jasmine Crockett never raised her voice, never called for outrage. She sat in her office that night, alone but not lonely, staring at Mateo Jimenez's photo on her desk. Her staff begged her to go live. The DNC asked her to headline a fundraiser. CNN requested an exclusive. She turned them all down. Instead, she opened her laptop and began typing a handwritten letter to Mateo's mother. She ended it with one sentence. "He wasn't invisible, and he won't be forgotten." The tape had ended. The whispers had faded. Even the feverish clatter of reporters' keyboards was gone. All that remained was stillness and the sound of a nation's breath being held. Jasmine Crockett sat tall, hands folded lightly before her, eyes fixed not on Joe Arpaio anymore, but on something larger, something heavier. She didn't need to raise her voice. Not now. She spoke quietly, clearly, as if every word she uttered would be carved in stone. "Mr. Arpaio," she began, "you were pardoned from prison, pardoned from sentencing, pardoned from the justice that so many in your custody were never even allowed to seek." Her voice didn't crack. It sharpened, like glass smoothing beneath a flame. "But you were not pardoned from memory. You were not pardoned from consequence. And you most certainly are not pardoned from history." She let that linger. Then she reached slowly for a sheet of paper. Not a document, not evidence. Just words. Her own. Written last night. She looked down at it once, then folded it away. Because history is not written in courtrooms. It's written in the hearts of those who survived what the courts ignored. In the scars left by silence. in the children who never got to grow up because your system never saw them as children. Now she looked directly at him. And history, Sheriff Arpaio, is watching you right now, listening to your every word, measuring every lie, recording every time you refuse to say the one thing you never have. I was wrong. A long pause. So no, this isn't revenge. It isn't politics. This is memory. This is justice spoken aloud, and it's happening in real time. Her voice dropped into something even colder, a verdict etched in quiet fury. You were spared a prison cell, but no one can spare you from the story we tell our children about what you did. And that story, she said, begins today. Then she sat back, hands folded, gaze steady. The room didn't erupt. It fell silent. The stillness was not empty, it was overflowing, with things no one could say, with truths too long buried. And for a moment, it wasn't about left or right, politics or headlines. It was just about witnessing, about seeing finally what had always been there. A woman in the gallery, mid-40s, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white, wiped tears silently from her cheek. A young man beside her, suit too big for his frame, reached for her hand but never quite touched it. A Capitol police officer, standing near the exit, shifted awkwardly, his own expression tight with something like grief. And then, like lightning in the stillness, came a single sound, a breath caught in a throat. It came from Joe Arpaio. He sat motionless, eyes blank, hands gripping the table edge so tightly his knuckles blanched. The tremor started in his fingers, barely noticeable, but the camera caught it, the one pointed directly at him, broadcasting in high definition to millions. That tremor, the first visible crack, his jaw clenched, then released. He reached for his water, but missed the glass by half an inch. And that somehow said more than any rebuttal ever could. And then it happened. From the back row a man stood, late 50s, face lined with years of silence, skin brown, weathered. He wore a worn-collared shirt, clean but faded, and in his hand he held a folded photo. No media badge, no nameplate. He didn't shout, he just whispered, and the room heard him anyway. Finally, he exhaled the word like a prayer that had waited 2 decades to be spoken. His voice shook as he added, "Someone said it, for all of us." The room didn't break into applause. It didn't need to, because truth doesn't need a microphone when it's finally spoken aloud. Across the country, the footage aired live. Commentators paused, not knowing what to say. Analysts stammered over their scripts. In living rooms from El Paso to Sacramento, people sat with hands over mouths, some crying, others simply frozen. For the first time, Sheriff Joe Arpaio, once America's toughest sheriff, looked small, human, breakable. The man who had built his reputation on toughness now sat in the ruins of his myth, surrounded not by iron bars or police allies, but by silence and truth. In Phoenix, a local news anchor choked up while trying to summarize the scene. She looked down at her notes, then into the camera. "I covered Tent City for 10 years. I interviewed inmates, guards, lawyers. I reported the statistics. But I've never seen a reckoning like this. Today, for the first time, people believed they were heard." In Texas, a high school civics class paused their lesson. The teacher rewound Jasmine's final line 3 times. One girl raised her hand and whispered, "Can I write about this for my college essay?" In D.C., Jasmine Crockett walked slowly out of the chamber, not with triumph, not with applause, but with purpose. Her staff said nothing. They didn't need to. Her silence now carried the weight of every voice that had been silenced before her. And Arpaio? He sat long after the hearing adjourned, alone at the table, his team huddled behind him, whispering legal strategy, press damage control, exit routes. But he didn't respond, because something had finally reached him. Not prosecution, but memory. Fan X. The room had cleared, but the silence she left behind still vibrated in the halls of Congress. Jasmine Crockett didn't walk out like a victor. She walked out like a woman who had just unburied a century of silence and left it in the nation's lap. Behind her, cameras tried to follow. Commentators tried to name the moment. But no soundbite could contain what had just happened. And yet the ripple became a wave before the sun even rose. By 7:43 a.m., the Department of Justice issued a formal press release. In light of new audio, internal documentation, and sworn congressional testimony, the Civil Rights Division is reopening its investigation into Maricopa County Sheriff's Office practices from 2008 to 2016. The nation blinked, then roared. Reporters swarmed the DOJ gates. Civil rights attorneys took to the airwaves. Old cases, previously dismissed or ignored, were being re-examined within hours. One headline from the New York Times summed it up best. From forgotten to federal, the reckoning begins. But that wasn't all. By noon, attorneys general in 11 states had issued a joint call to re-examine and potentially abolish qualified immunity, the decades-old legal doctrine that had shielded officers like Arpaio from personal accountability. Their argument was simple, brutal, and long overdue. When law becomes a mask, the face underneath must be exposed. In Denver, protesters held signs that read, "Immunity is not innocence." In Boston, city officials held a televised forum with victims of wrongful arrest. In Arizona, Governor Sanchez, once a quiet supporter of Arpaio, released a short statement that sent shockwaves. Silence is complicity. We will no longer be complicit. And above it all, one name was whispered, tweeted, sung, and shouted: Jasmine Crockett. Not for how loud she had spoken, not for theatrics or political flair, but because she had not flinched, not once, not in the face of a legacy built on power, fear, and public spectacle. While others had bent beneath the weight of old systems, she had stood, not shouting, but standing, speaking truth not with rage, but with precision. You were spared a prison cell, but no one can spare you from the story we tell our children about what you did. That line made it into classrooms, onto banners, into law school lectures. But it was her final line, delivered at the edge of silence, that the nation couldn't stop repeating: the law is not armor for the powerful, it is a shield for the powerless. By midnight, those words were everywhere, projected across the Lincoln Memorial in white light, printed in the Atlantic's cover story titled "A New Shield," stitched into protest banners in downtown LA, chanted in Spanish and English by students in New York. On Etsy, someone was already selling a poster with Jasmine's silhouette behind those words. By dawn, it had sold out. But in the Capitol, Jasmine didn't celebrate. She sat in her office, shoes off, eyes tired, watching footage from a town hall in Phoenix. Survivors were standing in a line 3 blocks long to speak, some trembling, some angry, all brave. Her aide came in with a tablet. "CNN wants you on prime time, tonight." Jasmine shook her head. "Let them talk first. The country's just beginning to listen." She didn't want lights. She wanted legacy. And legacy was already happening. In Kansas, a congressman who had once co-sponsored an anti-immigration bill reversed his position. Live. "I watched what happened in that room. I voted wrong before. I'm not going to die on the wrong side of justice." In California, the state bar announced it would review 132 convictions connected to ICE sweeps during the Arpaio years. A nonprofit launched a trauma hotline for former detainees. And in Texas, a school named its new debate hall the Jasmine Crockett Room. But Jasmine didn't post about any of it. She returned to Fort Worth. No cameras, no crowds. She visited the grave of Mateo Jimenez. Alone, no press statement, no flowers. Just a folded piece of paper tucked under the headstone. It read, "You didn't get a day in court, but you got a day in history." 3 days later, the DOJ announced criminal referrals for Arpaio's aides, based on the documents Jasmine had introduced into the record. Congressional leaders began drafting a bill called the Community Protection and Transparency Act, designed to limit federal cooperation with sheriffs under civil rights investigation. Jasmine didn't write it, but it bore her fingerprint in every clause. And still, she stayed silent. Until one Sunday morning, she appeared on Face the Nation, seated calmly in a blue dress, no notes, no talking points. The host asked, "Congresswoman Crockett, what do you say to critics who say this was just a personal takedown of Joe Arpaio?" She looked directly into the camera. "It's never personal when a child dies. It's never personal when families disappear. It's never personal to want justice. It's human. And if we ever lose sight of that, then we don't deserve to lead. The clip trended within minutes. That night, 60 Minutes aired a special called Tent City Truth and Aftermath. One of the closing shots showed a protester holding up a homemade sign. Jasmine didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She didn't run. She stood. And that, in the end, became her greatest act. Not shouting over power, but refusing to bow to it. The final gavel had long fallen. Arpaio had been escorted out. The camera crews packed up. The chants outside faded into the night. But long after the screens went dark, the silence Jasmine Crockett left behind kept echoing. Not the silence of defeat, the silence that follows truth, the kind that rearranges the room even after the people have left it, because something had happened that couldn't be edited, dismissed, or ignored. Jasmine didn't just speak truth to power, she disarmed it. Not with volume, not with rage, but with clarity, with composure, with the steady, brutal precision of a woman who had spent her life preparing for the moment she'd finally be allowed to speak without interruption. And when she did, the country leaned in. Not because she screamed, but because she didn't. In the days that followed, political commentators scrambled to define the moment. Pundits searched for labels. Crockett's courtroom masterclass. The fall of the toughest sheriff. History meets its reckoning. But none of those titles captured what it felt like to be there, or to watch it unfold live. Because what Jasmine gave America wasn't just a confrontation, it was a reckoning long denied. And from that reckoning came a lesson, not in politics, but in humanity. We often talk about justice as if it's a building, a courtroom, a badge. But Jasmine reminded us, justice is a person's name being remembered, a lie being confronted, a silence being broken. She showed us that cruelty doesn't always arrive with screaming. Sometimes it comes through bureaucracy, through policies written in cold ink, through handcuffs locked with polite hands, through terms like standard procedure, compliance, and law enforcement discretion. That's how the system hides the pain, by sterilizing it, by cloaking it in language that sounds professional, while destroying people's lives in ways no memo ever admits. But Jasmine peeled back that language. She showed us that what Arpaio called tent housing was exile under canvas in 49-degree heat, that what ICE called processing delays was a 12-year-old boy sleeping on concrete, that what a White House aide once called optics was a mother bearing her son in silence. And she didn't just tell us, she showed us with documents, names, voices, photographs, tears. She taught us that memory isn't a burden, it's a weapon, that facts aren't cold, they're sacred, that if the law does not bend to protect the most vulnerable, it will eventually break the rest of us too. 1 week after the hearing, a classroom in Phoenix played Jasmine's final statement on loop. The students, mostly Black and Latino, sat in stunned silence. One boy raised his hand and asked, "Can truth be loud even when someone whispers it?" The teacher smiled through tears. "That's exactly what it was," she said. "It was a whisper heard around the world." In Sacramento, a group of protest organizers read aloud the names of 75 detainees who had died in custody under Arpaio's policies. They lit candles. One woman, a former tent city guard who had turned whistleblower, stepped to the mic and said, "We enforced fear." She enforced truth. In El Paso, a mural appeared overnight. It showed Jasmine standing in front of a courtroom podium. Behind her, faces, hundreds, faint outlines of people once detained, now no longer invisible. At the bottom it read, "Truth doesn't need to scream, it just needs to survive." But the human lesson didn't stop at public memory. It seeped into institutions. Churches began hosting workshops on legal empathy, understanding the human cost behind every statute. Law schools revised their syllabi, including a unit on the Arpaio hearings under the label Justice versus Justification. Activist groups started teaching young people how to request body cam footage, how to document sweeps, how to demand truth even when systems prefer silence. And Jasmine? She declined the talk show tours. She turned down the Vanity Fair cover. Instead, she did something no one expected. She went back to the communities Arpaio had damaged. Quietly, no cameras, no headlines. She held a town hall in Guadalupe, Arizona, a town of 5,000 that had been targeted during racial profiling sweeps. She sat with elders who had buried cousins and sons. She hugged a woman who carried her brother's mugshot in her wallet. She answered questions from children. She listened to stories no one else had written down. And in that listening, she gave a different kind of justice, one without gavels, but with eyes that didn't flinch. What Jasmine Crockett gave America wasn't just a moment, it was a reminder that justice is not a courtroom, it's a conversation, that the law is not a fortress, it's a promise. And if we let that promise be worn only by those with power, it becomes armor. But if we build it with truth, it becomes a shield. Her final words, now quoted on billboards, on law journals, on protest signs across every coast, are still echoing. The law is not armor for the powerful, it is a shield for the powerless. That's the human lesson. And it is not finished. Because every time someone speaks up against cruelty, the echo grows. Every time someone tells a name the system forgot, the silence shrinks. Every time someone stands when the powerful enter the room, the myth of invincibility shatters a little more. And one day when the next Jasmine walks into the next room built to crush her, she'll already know. She doesn't have to raise her voice. She just has to raise her truth. But a story, no matter how powerful, is only memory unless it moves us. Jasmine Crockett stood her ground. She exposed what others covered. She faced down a system that devours the weak and protects the bold-faced. But she cannot stand alone forever. Because justice is not a moment, it's a movement. And movements need more than witnesses. They need participants. So now the camera turns, not to Jasmine, to you. You who watched and felt that chill when a 12-year-old boy's name was spoken. You who clenched your fists when the pardon became a political bargaining chip. You who thought, this is not my fight, but now understand that silence is not neutral. You who carry a badge. You who once wore a uniform. You who teach, who vote, who scroll, who post. This is where you come in, because systems do not change when truth is spoken once. They change when truth is repeated louder by those who once whispered. They change when laws are not just challenged by lawyers, but by citizens who refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. So ask yourself, will you allow laws to be used as shields for power, or will you help forge them into protection for the vulnerable? Will you vote for policies that punish the voiceless, or demand reforms that restore dignity? Will you walk past the tents, the fences, the jails built in the name of order? Or will you ask who they were built to contain? Because this is not about Joe Arpaio. It's not even just about Mateo Jimenez. It's about who we become when no one's watching. So call your representatives. Demand accountability. Join coalitions pushing to end qualified immunity. Volunteer legal aid to the undocumented. Film what they hope no one sees. Share what they tried to bury. And when the next courtroom opens, when the next name is read, when the next silence begs to be broken, be the voice that does not tremble. Jasmine Crockett lit the fire. Now it's ours to carry. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.